Welcome to LOLBins the Quieter Way. Thank you for following my virtual talk at SwordZeroCon 2023. I hope you're gonna find the time to also check the other talks this year. They're very interesting and some of them are delivered by my coworkers, who are amazing people. I really appreciate their work, so please check them out. Let's start talking about the title of this talk because it's not actually random. The reason why I picked this title is I want to express a very deep concept here. Why the quieter way? What I want to express here is that long gone are the days when we could deliver loud payloads like Meterpreter and still go through undetected. By now, ADR solutions detect this type of attacks, and we're dead in the water if we keep following them. The way the security scene is today, we need to do something better, so we need to keep a low profile and become quieter. And LOLBins, which are native operating system binaries, can greatly help attackers achieve their goals and be much quieter, because they allow attackers to use only what's already available in the operating system without installing or creating new files or tools. For this reason, LOLBins are becoming increasingly important in red teaming because adversaries keep using them successfully to achieve their results and compromise networks and financial systems and so on and so forth. But let's start with a brief introduction. This talk was inspired by a long-time IT career spanning for over 23 years, first as a sysadmin, then as a penetration tester. Over the last part of my career, I was able to realize the important difference between penetration testing engagements and red teaming engagements, because they're two completely different animals. In fact, their purpose is different. A penetration test is conducted to test how the client company defensive infrastructure can detect and counter the attacks that the penetration testing team will execute. So for this reason, it doesn't need to be stealthy and evasive, and most of the time it's not. We also provide normally our source IP addresses when we start a pen test, so the client company can whitelist our IPs and allow us to access their infrastructure. As the company knows we're coming, their reactions are pretty much skewed. They are not nearly close as what they would be if real-world attackers would compromise their systems. For this reason, pen tests are not evasive or stealthy, because we need to check how well a company detects us and stops us. Red teaming engagements, instead, being adversarial emulations, closely resemble real-world attacker strategies, so they need to be as stealthy and evasive as possible. A real-world adversary would like to go undetected for as long as they can. Another difference is that we cannot launch any and all attacks we want in a penetration test, because normally denial of service attacks or exploits that might cause instability and disrupt the client's operation are considered to be out of scope. Whereas a real-world adversary wouldn't have such scruples and wouldn't care about that. On the contrary, certain specific real-world adversaries, like the activist groups such as Anonymous, perform denial of service attacks most of the time. From these considerations, it descends that LOLBins are extremely useful for red teaming engagements, while they're not really on the table for penetration tests. We don't need them. So this is the series of topics we're going to talk about today, and they all move around the concept of living off the land that we're going to define in a little bit. After defining this concept, we're going to define what living off the land binaries or LOLBins means, why using them, what's their importance for red teaming engagements, and finally, we're going to demo some lesser known LOLBins. As an initial consideration, the security scene so far looks like a cat and mouse game between attackers and defenders, whereas attackers are widely advantaged. They only need to be right once. An interesting tool for studying LOLBins is the LOLBins project that tracks every binary script and library that can be used for living off the land techniques. We're going to define what living off the land means in a little bit. This project is available on GitHub and is constantly updated and maintained, so you might want to check it out every now and then for new additions. As I'm an offensive security professional, I'm going to mostly focus on offensive capabilities, but we're also going to provide indications for defenders, because the most LOLBins they know, the better they can counter their attacks. For this purpose, we're going to provide both a reference to the LOLBins project and a reference to the MITRE ATT&CK framework for each specific binaries we're going to demo. So let's start with the concept of living off the land, which means compromising a system using only tools coming with the operating system itself. In other words, we use what's already available within the operating system. We don't create new files. We don't upload new tools. We don't do anything that could create an audit trail that might reveal our presence. As a result of that, using native tools coming pre-installed on an operating system or LOLBins, attackers can keep a low profile. More specifically, LOLBins are native binaries having extra functionalities that can be useful to attackers. In other words, they have other than intended functionalities that are what developers had in mind when they created them, also some extra unintended functionalities that might be used for offensive purposes. On a wider perspective, LOLBins are signed by known vendors so they can blend in with legit user activities and network traffic. In other words, they go undetected because they look legit. Of course, this means that LOLBins are extremely important for red team. In fact, real-world attackers often use LOLBins to bypass detection and aid in malware delivery, because they don't create an audit trail as off-the-shelf software does. This implies that LOLBins can be very useful in red teaming engagement because they tend to closely resemble real attackers' strategies. LOLBins are really a breakthrough in penetration testing and red teaming because blue teamers don't always actively monitor them, or more exactly, they don't monitor all of them but only well-known ones. An operating system comes with a bunch of LOLBins that are not always actively documented, so detecting a new LOLBin can be like finding a zero day, at least for a while. Recently, a wider concept of LOLBin started to emerge because not only built-in operating system binaries, but binaries provided by known vendors can be abused as LOLBins. For example, some security researchers discovered that uninstallers for multiple EDR solutions contain tools that could be abused the same way as LOLBins do. Given these considerations, the new threat scenario brings to the conclusion that the most effective protection strategy against LOLBins is the concept of defense in depth. That provides a multi-layer protection. In fact, defense in depth allows to contain the business impact and the monetary cost from a breach. The security posture of an organization is represented like an onion, where the data or information to be protected is found in the innermost layer. The trick, though, is that each layer is increasingly hardened as we move from external to internal ones. So if bad actors want to reach the proprietary data, they need to increasingly employ more resources and assets, which might deter their attacks, because attacking a system protected this way becomes more and more expensive. This is a common graphical representation of this model. More modern EDR solutions lately moved away from pure detection strategies and instead focus on anomaly indicators. For example, instead of trying to detect all instances where RDP was used, they might want to focus on instances where somebody that weren't supposed to use RDP used it, like Linda in accounting, for example, instead of the administrator. Let's come to the last part and most important part of this talk. So let's demo some lesser known LOLBins. I picked this specific strategy in my talk because I noticed that most talks about this topic focus on some specific well-known LOLBins. The problem is these LOLBins are also well known to defenders who elaborated countermeasures and defensive strategies against them. So if we keep talking about always the same thing, it's a total waste of time. And that's why I introduce here something new. We're going to demo some LOLBins, but we follow some specific criteria. First of all, we only want LOLBins allowing attackers to download, write to disk, or execute code. They must be less known to the general public, come pre-installed in Windows, and must be only requiring ordinary user permissions. In fact, some operating system binaries require administrative permissions, but in my opinion they're less useful because this implies going through a privilege escalation which might not always be feasible or easily accomplishable. If you want to understand how many LOLBins we can find in a Windows system, we need to enumerate them. And for this purpose, we can use the dir command, as shown here. Once we have an output file listing all of them, we can check the help menu for each identified binaries to detect functionalities that might be used for unintended offensive purposes. What do I mean by this? Here I show an example that is replace.exe. If we analyze its help menu, we find an interesting functionality /a that allows adding new files to the destination directory. The interesting consideration here is that we can basically use replace.txt to copy file over instead of using a copy command. With that, using replace over copy might have some sideways advantages because maybe the copy command is more strictly monitored than replace because you don't expect to use replace to copy a file over. Before demoing LOLBins, we moved from an attack scenario where an attacker could gain access to a Windows system. The way they do this is totally irrelevant, so it might be through a CobbleStrike beacon or accessing an unlocked computer or in any other way. What we care about here is to analyze what LOLBins attackers could use to gain recon and execute code. And this consideration applies to red teaming engagements as well, of course. So this is the CobbleStrike attack scenario, pretty straightforward. A first interesting category of operating system binaries are these binaries allowing indirect command execution, in other words, allowing to run another executable through them. This functionality can be very useful to evade defensive countermeasures. In other words, if, for example, security policies block the direct execution of a specific program, for example PowerShell, we might be able to evade these restrictions by using a binary like conhost and running PowerShell indirectly through such a binary. So here's the demo of a specific command we're going to run, which is ipconfig. The reason why we run this command is that when we gain access to a system, the first thing we do is recon, and so we want to know the IP configuration of the target machine to analyze what networks we can access to. We notice that this specific target machine supports two different network adapters, so it can access two different subnets. This may come in handy later on for lateral movements, pivoting, and privilege escalation. Along the same lines as CamHost, we have Windows Terminal or wt.exe, so we can repeat the same considerations here. In this case, we launch Calculator to show execution. Going back to Recon, an interesting utility we can use is Windows Problem Steps Recorder or psr.txt. It's a utility allowing to record screen and clicks for troubleshooting purposes. The interesting unintended functionality is that PSR can record the target machine screen without generating a GUI, so it practically allows an invisible screen capture. In this case, we're going to run two different commands. The first one starts the screen capture, indicates the directory where to generate the output file without creating any GUI. The second command stops the recording and creates the output file that we see highlighted in the Windows Explorer output here. If we open the output file, we see the recording we created. I already hinted to that before. I talk about copy without copy here. Basically, you can use replace.txt to copy files around without using more predictable commands like copy, robocopy, or xcopy that are very likely more strictly monitored. In this specific case, we're going to copy a malicious Word document from VMware share folders to the documents directory. And here it is. Another interesting file is curl.txt, allowing to upload tools and payloads from remote systems into compromised systems. The interesting thing about this file is that it's a Windows version of the native curl command in Unix Linux, supported by the Windows subsystem for Linux. In other words, Windows now integrates Linux commands, so that allows us to run attacks using Linux binaries within Windows, which wasn't possible before. So in this case, we stand up a Python 3 HTTP server and we download a PHP exploit downloaded from exploitdb. Our command is successful as shown by the directory listing. Another opportunity an attacker might want to utilize is to compile Windows executables directly on the Windows machine without third-party software. In this case, we can use a file called pshell.xml available on GitHub. And when we compile this file with msbuild.txt, we're going to spawn a PowerShell prompt without directly running PowerShell.txt. Here it is. You notice that we never in any way ran PowerShell or interacted with PowerShell, yet Here we have a PowerShell prompt. Going back to indirect command execution binaries, we have the program compatibility assistant. In this case, we're going to launch PowerShell with it. Along the same lines, we can use the program compatibility wizard to launch an executable. In this case, we're going to use a Cobble Strike payload obfuscated through Scarecrow. So when we launch the command indicated here, the program compatibility troubleshooter starts up. If we accept the recommended settings and we click test the program, we can spawn the malicious executable. Along the same lines, we can use script runner, in this case to launch command prompt. Other than indirect command execution, attackers might want to achieve defensive agent when they find themselves in restricted environments such as kiosk mode, not allowing access to Windows Explorer. In fact, custom shell host can be used for this as it spawns Windows Explorer on the target machine. And once Windows Explorer is accessible, an attacker can do more and do more damage. Last but not least, we have work folders that can be used for defensive agent and persistence. Practically, it allows users to store and access work files on personal computers and devices. As we said, it allows storing and accessing work files from anywhere. So this has obvious security implications, as you might understand. So it could be used to evade defensive countermeasures or to hide as a persistence mechanism. For this reason, it shouldn't be run on a normal workstation. And this is what it looks like when you access the control panel through the command. So this is the agenda we developed today, and these are all the topics we talked about. Like we said before, all these topics move around the concept of living off the land, which is compromising a system using only native binaries coming with the operating system itself. After defining this, we define the concept of living off the land binaries, which are native operating system binaries that can be used for unintended offensive purposes because they have extra functionalities. Afterward, we want to understand why we should use LOLBins for red teaming engagement especially. And that's because red teaming engagement using LOLBins are more successful as they are much less loud and don't generate an audit trail that might lead to a discovery by blue teamers. And we end up demoing some lesser known LOLBins. That's because, in my opinion, more research and more study about lesser known LOLBins can allow red teamers to be more successful and blue teamers to better defend against sophisticated attacks performed using lesser known LOLBins. So that's all the time I got at my disposal today. I hope you guys enjoyed my talk and found it interesting. I'm very eager to receive your feedback and your comments. And please check also the other talks with Sword Zero Candy share. They're pretty interesting and enticing. Anyway, leave me a comment or a question and I'll try to answer them at the best of my abilities and as soon as possible. Thank you for your time and have a nice day.